Hey everyone, ready for a deep dive that might just shake up how you view success and failure? We're tackling Nassim Taleb's Fooled by Randomness.
Ooh, yeah, this one's a classic.
It really makes you question how much control we actually have over outcomes. We tend to think that hard work equals success, but this book digs into how randomness throws a wrench into that whole equation.
It really does.
I've been looking over the excerpts you provided,
Yeah.
and I'm ready to get into some hard truths about how we see the world.
Yeah, you know what I find so fascinating about Taleb's work is that he challenges those deeply ingrained assumptions about how the world works. You know, we love neat narratives. We love stories where effort leads to predictable
Yeah,
outcomes.
like a formula.
Right, exactly. But Taleb's argument is that we often confuse luck with skill,
Yeah.
you know, and we cling to those narratives even when they don't fit reality.
So basically, we're kind of creating this nice little story for ourselves
Right.
to avoid facing the fact that a lot of life is just kind of random.
Exactly. And one of the most compelling ways I think that he illustrates this is through what he calls the illusion of skill.
Okay.
He asks us to imagine someone playing Russian roulette. Imagine they win millions. Would you call that person a skilled investor?
I don't think so.
Probably not.
No,
But yet so often in the market, we do that same thing. We celebrate those who get lucky without really acknowledging the role of chance.
it's like we're so quick to, try to figure out like, okay, what's the secret? What's the formula
Yeah.
that we forget to even ask if there were any secrets to begin with?
That's a great way to put it. And to illustrate this point even further, Taleb contrasts two traders from his own experience. John, who made a fortune in high-yield bonds, and then Nero, a really skilled options trader. So John, he flaunted his wealth, but his strategy was basically a gamble. He was riding a wave of luck that could have crashed at any moment. But Nero, on the other hand, he was much more cautious. He understood the importance of managing risk in a world where unexpected events are inevitable. He was less flashy, but ultimately more successful, because his approach accounted for the role of chance.
So it's almost like, really understanding randomness isn't about being passive,
Right.
but it's about becoming more aware of the forces at play
Yeah.
and then making smarter decisions within that unpredictable environment.
Precisely. And that leads us to another one of Taleb's key concepts. Survivorship bias. We had this tendency to just focus on the winners, the
Sure.
survivors, without really considering all the people who followed those same paths but just failed. Like, it's assuming every actor is rich because we only ever see the famous ones.
Right, it's like the highlight reel.
Yeah, exactly.
You don't see the blooper reel.
So this is where things get really practical, How can we as listeners, or just people in general, how can we start to see past this survivorship bias and, get a more realistic picture of the world?
Yeah. How do we avoid those pitfalls?
Well, the first thing is to cultivate a critical mindset. When you see a success story, ask yourself, what are the hidden risks? What about all the people who tried and failed? Taleb illustrates this through the story of Carlos, an emerging markets trader. He enjoyed a period of success during a bull market, and he really attributed his success to skill. He doubled down even as things started to turn against him, and ultimately that led to his downfall.
Oh, so it's like that overconfidence.
Yeah, overconfidence.
Because you're riding that wave of success.
Right, and attributing it to the wrong things.
But really, it's just a matter of time before that wave crashes.
Exactly. We have this tendency to see patterns even where they don't exist. And we connect the dots in a way that just confirms what we already believe.
So we're creating those comforting narratives,
Right.
even if they're based on, not so solid ground.
Right. And those narratives can be really dangerous, particularly when it comes to risk.
Which leads us to another concept Taleb explores. Skewness. He actually uses a very personal example to illustrate this point. His own cancer diagnosis. So when he was diagnosed, he learned about the median lifespan for people with his condition. But he quickly realized that that average didn't really represent the reality of the situation because the distribution of outcomes was skewed.
So it wasn't just about the average lifespan,
Right.
but it was about the range of possibilities,
Yes,
the
ma'am.
chance that he could be an outlier. So I guess that means the average can sometimes be misleading. That's exactly right. Just like with Gould's cancer diagnosis, we need to be aware of situations where a few extreme outcomes can really distort the whole picture. This is especially relevant in investing, where, people throw around terms like bullish and bearish.
Right.
And it often oversimplifies things.
Yeah.
It's not just about the direction of the market, but also the magnitude of potential gains or losses. you could have a small chance of a huge loss that outweighs a high probability of small gains.
So that's really important to remember
Yeah.
for anybody thinking about investing.
Yeah.
It's not just about, being optimistic or pessimistic about the market. It's about understanding the range of outcomes
Yeah.
and making sure you can handle the worst case scenario.
Exactly. And this ties directly into his broader argument about probability blindness.
Okay.
We as humans just aren't wired to intuitively grasp probabilities.
So even if we understand the math, like on paper,
Right.
our gut can still lead us astray.
Exactly. Even the most intelligent people can fall prey to this. It's not about being smart. It's about how our brains are wired. And Taleb uses some really great examples to illustrate this. The blood type fallacy, the feminist bank teller problem.
Right.
All these examples just show how even really smart, educated people can make irrational judgments because of the way we perceive and process probabilities.
So how do we even begin to overcome this probability blindness?
It's definitely a challenge.
It sounds like we're fighting our own brains.
Yeah. But it's not an impossible one. Taleb's argument is that the first step is just to acknowledge the problem, to recognize that we're all susceptible to these biases.
Okay.
And from there, we can start to develop strategies for making better decisions. And this is where I think his admiration for George Soros comes in.
Okay.
Soros is known for being able to change his mind, to adapt his views based on new information, even if it contradicts what he previously believed.
So instead of being married to like a certain ideology or worldview,
Right.
he's constantly updating his mental models based on what the market's telling him.
Exactly.
Which in a way is exactly what the market is.
Yeah.
It's a game where the rules are constantly in flux.
That's a great way to put it. And I think this adaptability is crucial for navigating a world where randomness is so prevalent. We need to be open to new information, question our assumptions, and be willing to change our minds when the evidence demands it. It's the opposite of what John the high-yield bond trader did. He was so convinced of his brilliance that he failed to adapt when the market shifted, and that led to his downfall.
So it's not just about, being smart, having the right strategy at the start,
Right.
but it's that flexibility to adjust
Yeah.
when things inevitably change.
Exactly. And that brings us to another one of those fundamental concepts in Taleb's work. And that brings us to a concept that's really central to Taleb's whole philosophy,
Right.
the problem of induction.
Ah, yes, the famous black swan, right?
Exactly.
The idea that just because we've only seen white swans doesn't mean that black swans don't exist. So we can't assume something's impossible just because it hasn't happened before.
Exactly. We rely on past data to predict the future, but what happens when the underlying conditions change? The rules of the game can shift, and suddenly those past observations are no longer a reliable guide.
Right.
One way to think about this is imagine a child has an urn filled with black balls. They keep pulling out black balls, and so they assume all the balls in there are black.
Makes sense.
But then someone comes along and adds a bunch of white balls,
Sneaky.
right? And now their past observations are totally useless.
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
Yeah.
It highlights how dangerous it can be to just rely on historical data, especially in fields like finance where things are constantly changing.
Exactly. Past performance is no guarantee of future results.
Right, exactly. And this problem of induction, it seems like it's made even worse by our tendency to look for patterns,
Yeah.
even where none exist.
Right. Our brains are wired to try to find order in chaos,
Right.
even if that order is just an illusion.
So we're always trying to connect the dots.
Yeah.
Even if those dots are totally random. And, it seems like the media plays a big role in this as well.
Yes.
Taleb is pretty critical of how journalists often contribute to this problem.
He makes this really interesting comparison between journalism and history. He argues that, a competent journalist should approach their work with the same kind of detachment as a historian, recognizing that the information they're presenting might not be as groundbreaking as it seems in the moment.
Right.
But in reality, journalists are often incentivized to grab our attention to sensationalize events.
To get those clicks.
Right, exactly.
Right.
They're obsessed with novelty, constantly bombarding us with information that's often irrelevant or even misleading.
Yeah, it's like we're drowning in information,
Right.
but starving for wisdom.
That's a great way to put it. And Taleb argues that this constant focus on, the new and the novel actually distracts us from what we can learn from the elders, from those timeless lessons that history can teach us.
So we're so focused on the present that we lose sight of the past.
Right. And he even suggests that we should be wary of anything that's presented as urgent news because it's likely just noise.
Okay, so how do we navigate this information overload?
Yeah.
without becoming completely overwhelmed.
Well, I think it starts with skepticism.
Okay.
Question everything, especially information that's presented as definitive or urgent. And remember, sometimes the most valuable information is actually the information that's missing.
Oh, right, like Sherlock Holmes. The
Exactly.
dog that didn't bark.
The dog that didn't bark was the key clue because it suggested that something unusual was going on.
Right, it's about noticing the absences
Yes.
as much as the things that do happen.
Exactly. And that requires a shift in perspective. We need to step back from the constant stream of information and look for the patterns that really matter and recognize that those patterns might be subtle or counterintuitive.
So it's not just about, consuming information.
Yeah.
It's about filtering it,
Mm-hmm.
analyzing it, understanding the context.
Yeah. Precisely. And this is where his emphasis on critical thinking comes in. We need to be able to question our assumptions, to challenge the conventional wisdom, and be open to the possibility that we might be wrong.
He's really critical of those who kind of marry their ideas
Yes.
and cling to them even when the evidence contradicts them.
He argues that this rigidity can be really disastrous, and instead we need to be willing to divorce our ideas,
To let go.
to let go when they no longer serve us, to adapt our thinking as new information emerges.
So it's about flexibility,
Yeah.
open-mindedness, and willingness to learn from our mistakes.
Yes, and this ties back to his point about the problem of induction.
Right.
We can't let our past experiences blind us to new possibilities.
Right, or prevent us from adapting
Exactly.
when circumstances change.
That's a great connection. And this adaptability is especially crucial in fields like finance, where, randomness really reigns supreme. Taleb argues that we need to shift our focus from trying to predict the unpredictable
Okay.
to building robustness and resilience.
So instead of trying to time the market or pick the winning stocks,
Right.
we should focus on diversifying our investments, managing our risk, making sure we can weather the inevitable storms.
Exactly. It's about acknowledging that we can't control everything and focusing on what we can control, our own preparations and our reactions to events. This requires a certain level of detachment, a willingness to kind of let go of the illusion of control.
So this all sounds very philosophical, but how do we actually put these ideas into practice?
Yeah.
How do we make better decisions in a world that is, inherently uncertain?
Well, Taleb offers a few practical suggestions. First, he emphasizes the importance of focusing on the things that we can control.
Okay.
So instead of trying to predict the future, we should focus on building robustness and resilience into our lives and our systems.
So like diversifying our investments,
Yeah.
having a backup plan, making sure we're not overexposed to any one particular risk.
Exactly. It's about preparing for the unexpected, acknowledging that we can't control everything, and making sure we're able to weather the storms that inevitably come our way. And a key part of that is learning to manage our emotions.
Right, because if we let our emotions, fear and greed and all of that
Yeah.
dictate our decisions, then we're more likely to make mistakes.
Exactly. And, Taleb is a big proponent of Stoicism,
Right.
the ancient philosophy that emphasizes controlling our reactions to external events.
Yeah, he talks a lot about that.
He argues that true strength lies not in trying to control the uncontrollable,
Right.
but in mastering our own internal state.
So it's that inner peace.
Yes, exactly. And this mastery comes from understanding our own biases, recognizing the role of randomness, and accepting that we can't control everything. It's about finding that peace and equanimity in the midst of uncertainty.
It's a really powerful message,
It is.
but it also requires, a certain level of detachment,
Right.
which can be difficult in a world that's so focused on outcomes.
Absolutely. And Tala acknowledges this challenge. He talks about the difficulty of thinking about a vacation as a linear combination of two different destinations.
What does he mean by that?
Like Paris and the Bahamas.
Oh,
Our brains can really only handle one state at a time.
so we can picture ourselves, strolling through the Louvre or lounging on a beach,
Right.
but trying to hold both images simultaneously in our minds is almost impossible.
Right. And I think this relates to our tendency to, focus on the most likely scenario rather than considering the full range of possibilities.
Yeah, it's like we're so focused on the destination that we forget to think about all the possible detours and roadblocks we might encounter along the way.
Yeah, and this tendency to fixate on the most likely outcome, it can lead to some real blind spots.
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to understanding risk.
Right, like we just assume that the most likely thing is going to happen.
Right, exactly. And Taleb illustrates this point with the example of buying an option. An option gives you the right but not the obligation to buy or sell an asset at a certain price in the future.
Okay.
Most people just focus on the most likely outcome, which is that the option will expire worthless.
So they're basically betting that the market won't move that much in their favor.
Right.
But doesn't that also mean they're missing out on, you know, if the market does swing their way, they could have a really big payoff?
Exactly. They're falling prey to what he calls option blindness. They're not fully grasping that asymmetric nature of the payoff.
Sure.
The fact that a small upfront investment could yield a huge return.
So they're playing it safe, but also limiting their potential upside.
Exactly. And this bias seems to show up in other areas as well, particularly in how we perceive risk.
Yeah.
Taleb talks about how people often confuse the frequency of an event with its magnitude.
Okay, how so?
Well, he uses the example of market commentators who often talk about life expectancy in a way that can be really misleading. They might say something like, the average person loses 7 years of life expectancy because of this or that.
Right.
But that statement doesn't really capture the nuances of life expectancy.
Right, it's not like once you hit that average age, you just suddenly drop dead.
Right, exactly. It seems like they're mixing up different types of life expectancy.
Are there multiple types?
Yeah, there's unconditional life expectancy and then there's conditional life expectancy.
Okay.
As we age, assuming we're healthy, our conditional life expectancy actually increases.
Oh, interesting.
We've already survived many of the risks that could have shortened our lifespan.
So it's almost like saying, if you survive playing Russian roulette 5 times in a row, you've actually increased your chances of surviving the 6th round.
Yeah, this is a rather morbid but accurate way to put it.
Yeah, but it makes sense.
And this example just highlights how easily we can be misled by statistics, especially when they're presented in a way that appeals to our emotions rather than our reason.
Right, it's all about the framing.
Exactly. And this brings us back to Taleb's central argument. We need to develop a more sophisticated understanding of probability.
So instead of just thinking about like the most likely outcome,
Right.
we need to consider that full spectrum of possibilities.
Yes, especially when it comes to risk management.
Okay, that makes sense. And this leads us to one of Taleb's most impactful concepts, the idea of the black swan event.
Oh, yes, the black
Events that catch us completely off guard.
Yeah, the ones that nobody sees coming but have a massive impact.
Right. And, Taleb argues that these black swan events are way more common than we realize.
Right.
And that our traditional ways of thinking about risk just don't account for them.
Yeah, and he uses the example of the 2008 financial crisis,
Perfect example.
which was triggered by a cascade of events that very few experts predicted.
Nobody saw it coming.
Right. The models that were supposed to, predict and manage risk, they failed spectacularly. Yeah. Leading to a global economic meltdown.
So it was a stark reminder that we can't just rely on past data
Right.
and, statistical models to try to predict the future.
Especially when it comes to complex systems like financial markets.
So if we can't predict these black swan events,
Right.
what can we do?
Well,
Do we just have to resign ourselves to being blindsided by these unpredictable events?
not at all. While we can't predict when a black swan event will occur, what form it will take, we can prepare for the possibility of such events.
Okay, so how do we do that?
Well, Taleb argues that we need to shift our focus from trying to predict the unpredictable to building robustness and resilience.
So instead of putting all our eggs in one basket,
Yeah,
we diversify our investments, build redundancy into our systems, and make sure we have a margin of safety.
exactly. It's about preparing for a range of possible scenarios, including those that seem highly unlikely, It's about shifting from a mindset of optimization to a mindset of resilience.
So it's not just about maximizing gains, but it's about minimizing potential losses
Right.
and making sure that we can withstand shocks to the system.
Precisely. And this requires a fundamental shift in thinking, a willingness to embrace uncertainty and let go of that illusion of control.
Which is really hard to do.
It is.
Yeah.
And, this resonates with the Stoic philosophy that Taleb admires so much.
All right. It's about accepting what we can't change.
Yeah,
And focusing on what we can.
exactly. We can't control the weather, but we can choose to carry an umbrella.
I love that analogy.
And, ultimately, that's what this whole deep dive into Fooled by Randomness has been all about. Recognizing that luck and chance play a huge role in our lives.
Yeah.
Understanding our own biases and limitations.
Yeah.
And developing strategies for navigating this uncertainty with wisdom and grace.
It's been a really enlightening conversation.
It has.
So for our listeners out there, what's like the one key takeaway that you hope they'll remember from all of this?
I would say the most important lesson is to cultivate a healthy dose of skepticism, especially when it comes to, claims of expertise or predictions about the future. Remember that randomness is always at play,
Yeah.
and even the most brilliant minds can be fooled by it.
It's a good reminder to stay humble, stay curious, and, never stop questioning our assumptions.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
And as Taleb himself put it, next time you see someone boasting about their incredible success, take a moment to consider, are they a skilled master of the universe or just a lucky monkey at a typewriter? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
We'll see you next time.